Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Mindful Place Summit. I'm your host, Crystal Jensen, and today we sit down with Dr. Michael Yellowbird. He's a celebrated scholar, author, inspirational teacher, and passionate advocate for decolonization, Indigenous social innovation and creativity, and institutional and environmental system change. He has recently been appointed as the Dean of Faculty of Social Work at the University of Manitoba. Thanks so much for watching. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Today we get to speak with Dr. Michael Yellowbird. Welcome to the Mindful Place Summit.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kristen.
I am so excited to introduce you to our audience and hear a little bit about your story and how you got into working in mindfulness with youth.
Yeah, well, it's quite a long story. Starting back in about 1975, when I was an undergraduate student, I first began to practice meditation and mindfulness. Way before there was an interest, and way before there were teachers, and that were widespread or more, and it wasn't really being applied to any populations whatsoever. It was something that was very mystical and out of the mainstream of American society. But it was something that I think folks were finding, and I found myself in my own practice, that it really helped to kind of integrate for me some really interesting explorations and understanding of the thoughts that I was having. Some of them were very traumatic thoughts, some were thoughts of confusion, some of the thoughts were just wondering, and I had this curiosity. So I started practicing then, and I've maintained it for a long period of time. And then when I first started teaching mindfulness to young people, it was probably in the early 1990s when I was teaching with one of my students actually at the University of British Columbia when I was an assistant professor there. I was teaching some of the street youth how to do mindfulness practices. And it was something that really, and these were Indigenous youth, that they really connected to it. They really felt a sense of strong association with their own traditions, their own contemplative traditions. And then at that point, and of course this is before a lot of people were teaching or even knew about mindfulness. So I was influenced by Jon Kabat-Zinn's work and what he was doing at the time. And then other people started slowly writing about that in terms of bringing mindfulness to general populations, to deal with particular kinds of maybe psychological, emotional, and physical illnesses. So later on, I practiced and done mindfulness with a number of different Indigenous groups in different parts of the country in North America. And more recently, I started working with Native children and found, again, they had such a connection to mindfulness. And what I found, what was very successful with Native children was that to connect it to their own contemplative traditions and storytelling and origin stories, and of course, their connection with the natural world, which is very strong in many, many Indigenous communities. So one of the things that I found more recently now that makes a lot of sense to me when I'm thinking about working with kids is not to just get them into mindfulness right away, but to get them to understand how they fit into the larger scheme of the world, and how their breath does, and how their presence does, and how they're connected to all these landforms, these mountains, these trees, these waters, these birds, the winds, the animals. And it's very natural because if you look at Indigenous people, this is really their history. This is really their oral history as well as their cultural history, the connections, being connected to all these things. And one of the ways that I found in creating a safe environment for kids, or a stimulating environment for kids for mindfulness, is for them to understand what are known as murmurations. Like a lot of people look at murmurations with birds. And so if you look at the birds, the starlings, for example, how they fly in these different patterns, and the patterns, they're very graceful, right? They turn and they change direction just in a moment's notice, and thousands of birds coordinate that. How do they do these complicated movements, right? And I think this is what's really important, I think, with children, especially with Native kids, because they, like I said, they have such a connection to those kinds of stories. And of course, if you're like my wife is from the West Coast, and if you're out there and you've ever seen fish schooling, it's very similar, right? So humans are like that too. They move in these different kinds of ways, sometimes thoughtfully, sometimes they mimic and just follow along, right? And that's what we do as human beings. We don't really think about it or contemplate it very deeply. Sometimes people come in the room and then 10 kids sit down and they all start meditating, close their eyes, and maybe the 1 or 2 children that aren't doing it after a while, feel on the outside of the group, and then they sort of join right in. So I think that's one of the things is that it's in my thinking in research, a lot of it has to do with evolutionary psychology, about being part of a group or a collectivist kind of endeavor, and also the biology that we have the mechanisms in our brain and in our bodies to do that kind of thing, right? We have different kinds of regions in the brain that help stimulate and raise our levels of dopamine and serotonin, the feel-good and reward chemicals, when we are doing things that are fun or that they create within us a sense of calm, and slows our heart rate. And when I was a kid, one of the teachers that I had used to do that after we came in from recess and play. We'd come in, she'd put our heads on our desk, and we'd lay there for 5 minutes, and 90% of the kids would fall asleep. But then she'd wake us up, and then we'd be sort of a bit, charged and ready to go. And that's what all the current neuroscience says, is that getting those short naps or getting that, raise in the level of blood flow to the brain, those are all things that come together. So in my work with kids, mindful play is perfect, because I think movement and sitting, meditation are very important. Like I said, we have all the biological and physiological components to do those kinds of things. Plus, we have this beautiful mind for imagination, and kids are so good at imagination. But it's up to us then to kind of help them harness that, right? So I do a lot of visualization exercises with kids, more than just watch your breath. What color is your breath? What does it look like to breathe out if you're a dragon, or if you're a buffalo, or if you're an eagle flying high in the cold? What does it look like? What does it feel like, right? And that's for for little kids, and even for like you and I. As I see you shaking your head, it's right. Yeah, we're seeing a picture of that, and that's what I'm saying. We have these component parts, as children do, that we want to help continue to get them to build their plasticity in the play in their brain, and in the understanding how important that is. So these are some of the things that I think about when I do the work that I do.
I'm so inspired by you talking and hearing you explain. It seems so like natural, right? And when we talk about mindfulness, sometimes there's a perception that it has to be that extra thing. But what I'm hearing from you, and what's so beautiful about the Indigenous culture, and you're mentioning the Native children, is they connect with nature, with Mother Nature, right? And for them, it's this natural enrichment of just hearing the trees and feeling the trees, and this is naturally what they're around a lot of the times. And so for the urban children, it's how interesting that we're embracing this nature, to be out in nature, to go and be within the wild. But it's so cool to understand the culture of that. It's just nature, it's natural, it's a part of them. And I know in my practice, bringing in nature into my urban center, allowing the children to feel that, to listen to the birds, to be with the birds, it's this totally new way of living for them, because that's not something that's been in their culture. So it's a beautiful reflection for me. And, when I hear you speak, and I hear, you talk about the birds, well, I'm right there with you. I can visualize that. And the piece of us as adults, with our imagination as children, we go to school. And in my culture, I would say my upbringing, it was like, stop daydreaming. What are you daydreaming? Focus on the teacher. And that constant drive to focus in on what I'm saying versus allowing my imagination. So that piece completely speaks to me. The encouraging of the imagination, the fostering that growth mindset, and just being amongst nature where, that's why when we first got on the call before we started recording, I was curious, what's the weather like out there? What's it like in Manitoba versus, over here in BC? So I wanted to say thank you about that, because as we sit and as we listen and connect with nature, there's those beautiful undertones of being. And what I'm hearing for you is it's very natural. It's very natural for the children that you work with.
Yeah, and I think it's natural for all kids. And what you're talking about in terms of urban children, I mean, we can think about it in terms of colonization, that even urban children, no matter who they are, what race they are, gender, or anything like that, that their movement has been colonized by industrial society. Their play has been colonized. Their sleep has been colonized by industrial society. And so this is why mindfulness, I think, has taken off, in the States in particular, because it's such a driven industrial society. And, we cannot reach our full intellectual and creative potential living in a society like that. Part of what stimulates the growth of our brains are having those kinds of diverse interactions with different kinds of environments. Hot, cold, warm, desert, leafy, mountainous, watery climates. This is who we are, and this is how we evolved as people, to have contact with that. And this is why when you let children go, they go into this level of exploration, and they're looking at things very carefully. So you might say mindfulness is a very, very natural component for children if they're allowed to go along and do the discovery as they examine things, as they learn about, different flowers, or if their observations on something could be, for all intents and purposes, object meditation, as they sit there and take in the fullness, and this is what we tell people in mindfulness, right? See things, with a new eye, a fresh eye, right? With a beginner's mind, right? And that's where children, I think, trump us as adults. But we've really kind of taken that away from them by colonizing them in an urban setting, by colonizing their creativity. So decolonizing of mindfulness then has to be aware that, children are faced with these limitations. So when we do mindfulness with kids, it's not just to do about emotional regulation, which I think it's kind of overused for that, because I think emotional regulation also stunts creativity, because children sometimes, in order to get their creativity out, they need to yell, they need to scream, they need to posture, they need to move and pose, those kinds of things. That doesn't happen in the classroom. That doesn't happen under controlled environments, And children were never, our children are never in that way configured to be that kind of mold. And that's why I think mindfulness has come in, is because children's acting out and their display of being unhappy and having difficulty regulating emotions is a symptom of the society that we live in, that's colonized our play, that's colonized, as I said, our behavior. And we don't even think about it twice. So I think that's something that we need to think about.
Absolutely. And while you're talking, I think about a group of children that I brought to the forest, right? And some of them have never really experienced the forest, or maybe their parents, if they've come pick them up at the center, are they dirty today? It's like, yeah, they're going home wet and dirty. They're absolutely exploring. But it's interesting to see how they react when they're, allowed to explore. And you're right. It's this, they're naturally going to play. They're naturally going to be, they're naturally going to explore. And us as adults, or however, like you say, it's colonized in a certain way where it's very potent and detrimental to their development to just put them in a little box, right? Versus taking down those walls and just letting them be in that.
Yeah. And to me, I'm a runner. I enjoy doing that. I have most of my life. I know that, a lot of the research that talks about children and performance, we know that it's so important for kids to move. Not to be confined for several hours a day sitting in desks. I mean, that's what evolutionary biologists would call mismatch. We never evolved to sit as long as we sit, and kids in particular. today have higher levels of obesity, weaker bones, more levels of distraction and those kinds of things because they are, forced to sit there and focus on something that doesn't do much for their creative mind. They need more play. So, and that's a big piece of colonization that really needs to be sort of looked at, So.
And the awareness as adults to remove our expectations of what play is, right? And
Right.
allow children to explore and recognize when we're stopping play or letting it happen. Because I see that a lot of the times happening where educators or parents will stop something due to fear or due to, what are people going to think? And a lot of the times these children, they're being hindered, right? Or if you talk about a little bit of risky play and stuff like that, where they need to learn through these problem solvings and exploring to be able to make decisions as adults later in life. And I've seen, different various ways that children have been brought up over the last few years in my practice, 17 years as an educator. And I can really see the ones that are able to explore and to be with their parents, having that position of removing the expectation and play versus the parents that are fearful based, where the children are coming and they can't go home dirty and they have to rate certain things. There's just so many parameters and the child just wants to play. And when you let them play, the exploration and the mud and the dirt and the laughter, and it's so beautiful to see. And those are the children that don't want to go home at the end of the day, right? They're like, no, let me stay. But it's a beautiful reflection to kind of have that observation and just with no judgment, just go inward as an educator and say, am I stopping play from happening? What are my expectations of play? And how can I reposition to just allow it to happen and to let go? Because a lot of that time, that's the adults, right?
Right. I mean, there's a really interesting African proverb or saying, I guess it says, a child not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth, right? And I think that's what we see in society today, is that the village that we live in, doesn't really embrace a child's needs in that way, right? And play is certainly like one of them, right? Exploration is one of them. Discovery is one of them, right? And also trying to figure out how my identity is and where I'm at, to fit into this, all that's happening right now. So then it gets us back to murmurations. How do you move with the flock? How do you flow with the school, right? Or how do you run with the pack? That kind of thing. And that's what we do. And all throughout our lives, little kids all the way to adults, we have our own packs, we have our own schools, we have our own pods, if we're killer whales or whatever it is, and that's what we need to embrace, I think. And that's one of the things that's fundamental, I think, about mindfulness, is that we can't forget that, when we're teaching kids practices, is that, beyond the breathing, beyond the regular, the emotional regulation, there is something else that's pretty dynamic in the child that we don't want to colonize, even with mindfulness. We want to be able to kind of balance it, and embrace children. Otherwise, if we don't embrace, them, they come back and they're wondering about how they fit into the scope of those kinds of things, right? And that's why this African saying to me is really important, because if children are not embraced by the village, they'll burn it down to feel its warmth, right? And trying to get the attention, and that's what you talk a bit about with emotional regulation. So. That's a symptom. But we need to pay attention to it. So.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that. Now, we've mentioned prior to this call, is there an experience or something you want to bring our listeners through? I know you mentioned that you're very passionate about bringing children into more of the flow of things. So if we could kind of explain to our teachers, educators, parents, whoever is watching, what does that kind of look like and the benefits of that within learning?
Well, I think it's so important for teachers and all of us to be good observers, first of all, to kind of understand our own flow, how our own personality, how our lack of flow, and how we get stuck or embedded or bogged down into daily kinds of tasks, prevents us from understanding the flow of children, to understanding the flow of a room, to understanding, how important it is to have these particular kinds of signals there for us to read, how kids are feeling. And I think that's the one thing, is that we just don't take enough time to check in with kids. We don't, a lot of times we start out with a lesson right away, or we start out with something without really finding out. And we talk a good game about that, how children are feeling. But we know that as educators, I just had a conversation with a number of faculty and the president of our university. We're doing a strategic planning, talking about, how we have to do things and what's it going to look like, in the next 5 years or whatever, and so on. And my contribution was, I think, we really need to sit down and create for ourselves a think tank where we have all these ideas coming in, and we're exploring, issues and problems with solutions and answers that, are generated by, like, crowdsourcing, right? How you bring people together and we come up with all these brilliant ideas. And I think that, for us is a lot about, to me, a very important thing. Children are little barometers to me. They're barometers of the not only the environment, but what's happening in the world. They're like the miner's canary, right? They are the ones that sense if something is not right or not in place, or they ask the questions we don't want to ask, and they give answers we would never give, right? Because that's who they are. They're at this level of discovery and creativity and the questioning. So for me, it's that kind of thing when I think about, when I'm working with really not only just children, but anybody, right? To kind of value them, not as an individual only, but also as a group that has flow, that moves in a particular kind of way. Like, again, I'll mention these starling murmurations, right? How do we get the flow to move in this nice synchronized pattern, right? And sometimes it takes what I think Ellen Winter talked about. She's an educator. I think she was she's a psychologist. No, she's an education person. But she called it the rage to master. The rage to master. And by looking at how gifted kids are compelled to find a solution, and they spend and engage themselves and their energies to find a solution. And these are the ones they call the gifted kids, but all kids do that. Everyone has at some level the rage to master something, right? And I think that's kind of partly what Malcolm Gladwell was talking about before. Other people have talked about it earlier, about the 10,000 hour rule. You've probably heard of that, where, from conservatory studies, that children that practice, the violin for 5,000 hours get to be like these really great performers. Right? They practice 7,500 hours, they get to be national class performers. 10,000 hours of practice, they're world-class performers, right? So that's a bit simplified, but we know that that's really what it takes to develop a flow, is that the practice of flow, right? It's like the practice of breathing. When you come back to do mindfulness, it's really about your own practice as a mindfulness teacher. That's going to get you out a lot of questions and bumps and obstacles in the road. And when you're teaching people, right, especially people who have been traumatized by a system, a lot of times you have to always go back to that anchor. Who am I? And what has my practice taught me over all these years? Have I practiced long enough? Have I practiced deeply enough? Have I practiced enough on my own? Have I practiced enough with a group? And so I think that's the power of grouping, as I mentioned, these murmurations. Children will recognize their power as they come together and play. And you'll see that they'll do innovative things as a group to solve a problem. Adults do the exact same thing. Animals do the exact same kind of thing. So I think that's the beauty of that kind of group intelligence, is to kind of get that flow and kind of be able to read the flow. But we as leaders, I'll say this last thing, have to be stable. We have to be good pack leaders. We have to be stable people. Mm-hmm. And we have to be able to kind of allow the flow to move along and to kind of move it at the right pace based upon, the different kinds of elements and the qualities and the strengths and the capacities that the individuals have as a group. Because sometimes there'll be weaker links in the group. And you'll see that if we allow this to be smoothly and not breed competitive individualism, we'll see other people pick other people up to move them along, right? This happens in the animal world as well. It happens in the plant world. It happens, in all worlds. So this is, to me, again, part of what flow is all about. And we have to be very discerning as teachers and instructors. And it takes some time. It took me some time to learn how to do that. So,
And what would you say is your go-to practice, personally, your practice that kind of supports you before going into a class to kind of prepare you?
well, I think expect the unexpected. I know that's such a cliche, but it's good to know. I mean, there are so many iterations that exist in the world of things that people can do to act out or to think or to be a particular kind of way. This is why, in most cultures around the world, at one time, age was such a huge attribute to societies, because wisdom had been accumulated by those elderly people in those different societies by observation and by experience. And at some point, they began to dampen down some of their fear, their confusion, and whatever, and just let things kind of unfold naturally. But at certain ages, you'll see those kind of upticks and that kind of fear, that kind of confusion, those kinds of things. So wisdom, I think, is a very, very powerful thing that I've kind of drawn upon. And I was lucky to be raised in a culture, in a community where there was a lot of respect for elders and a respect for that wisdom. It's not like today where we have just knowledge. We can go on the search engine and Google and look something up. That's much different than sitting there in front of an elder or sitting in front of someone who's got this accumulated knowledge that can teach us. And of course, they bring us along and they mentor us, and we do this time, under them, studying and learning. And it's about relationship building in that way. So I think that's, for me, something that I've kind of brought, I think, in my own role to a classroom, to teaching mindfulness, to teaching students, at graduate or PhD level, or wherever I'm teaching in current institution or other institutions that I've been in. So wisdom, like as I say, is a very, very important commodity to me. So.
Absolutely. Well, I'm resonating with everything that you're saying. I'm super grateful for spending time with you today, and really appreciate your wisdom as, expanding my awareness as well. If there was one last piece of wisdom, or if there was one, another takeaway for you to share with our audience today, what would that be?
Well, I think we all have to play. I mean, this is about play. I think you have to learn, and I think that's very important. I think that adults in industrial societies have forgotten how to play. There's just not enough time, and we'll spend more time in front of Netflix or some of these other kinds of venues where, because of the stress and because of the demands on our time, that we just don't get outside anymore. And that's kind of taken us away from nature. It's taken us away from something that's vital to us, right? Things we could have noticed in nature or been around nature or understood of nature it's not being communicated to us because we're closing ourselves off to nature. And I think that's something we can think about for our own children. We're in a time of very dramatic change on the planet. A colleague and I, Dr. Chris Clark, and I just finished a book, and we talk a lot about that, where we are as a planet, as we are as a species, as we are in terms of, these different kinds of threats that exist, but also the opportunities that we have to begin to change things, right? And we're coming out of a pandemic. So we have to use this opportunity for people who are now aware of how quickly things can change, that we can engage ourselves in actions for change at a very, at a level that takes care of systemic, institutional racism and hate and those kinds of things, and begin to engage, kids and young people into mindfulness practices that will help build levels of compassion and understanding, right? I mean, that also goes for leaders, goes for teachers, it goes for politicians and mothers and fathers, and all of us, really need to be engaging in play as well as mindfulness, I think, practices that can help generate, all these different kinds of benefits in our lives. So it's not something we should practice on the weekend or during a workshop, but this really needs to be kind of a daily part of our lives, just like flossing our teeth or brushing our teeth every day has to be something we engage in. So, it's the challenge is there before us. Whoever picks it up, whatever teachers will pick it up and bring it to their classroom are going to be the people that are going to be shaping the next generation of people who are going to be able to be the game changers. They're going to be able to they're going to be involved in systems change that dramatically, hopefully, will bring us back from the brink that we're at right now. But it's those people that are not afraid to go against the grain or swim against the stream, but are brave and daring enough to bring these kinds of practices into their classrooms, into their teaching and learning, and then of course draw from the wisdom of others that have done this before. So
absolutely. Be the change. I absolutely love that. Your words of wisdom. I'm going to go back and rewatch your interview because I really, really enjoyed it. Dr. Michael Yellowbird, thank you for your time today. So much gratitude, as mentioned, to you for coming on. And thanks so much for our listeners for watching.
thank you.